You're listening to The Secret to My Success, an interview-style podcast that asks our guests what trait, skill, or characteristic they possess that's made them a success. Hosted by Shelby Skurhawk.
My guest today, I guarantee, you're going to love this guy. Richard Sheridan is author of Chief Joy Officer: How Great Leaders Elevate Human Energy and Eliminate Fear. He's also author of Joy Inc., about building Ann Arbor-based Menlo Innovations. In this excerpt from our interview, Sheridan shares a powerful story about a grieving technique using plastic masks and why that's a metaphor for what we project outwards versus how we really feel.
A group came in from an amazing nonprofit here in Southeast Michigan called Ellie's Place. And Ellie's Place is named after Ellie Stover, a little girl who died when she was very young and left behind 4 grieving siblings and parents, of course. And Betsy Stover, as mom, realized there was no support group for her children. There was no place to go to figure out how to process these emotions that the kids were going through, her kids. So she started this place called Ellie's Place, named in honor of Ellie Stover. And they came in, they started talking to us about their mission and what their practices and that. And they started telling us the story about these white plastic masks they use as a particular way of processing your grief. And this was particularly focused on teenagers who had a lot of difficulty with a lot of these emotions because they started burying them. And so what they had the teenagers do is write on the outside of the mask, the side of the mask that everyone would see, what they wanted the world to believe about them. And they would say things like, I'm okay now. I'm past it. I've moved on. I'm happy. All the things the world wants to see, because quite frankly, if we run into somebody who's grieving, we try and get them to that place as quickly as possible, right? We think we're well-meaning, but we want to hear from them that they're getting past it and that sort of thing. What they also have the teens do is write words on the inside of the mask. What are they really feeling? How are they processing those emotions? And they might say things like, when will the pain go away? Why, God? Lonely, scared, hurting, guilty. And then what they have the teens do after they've done this is they show the masks to each other. And the teens get to see what others who are going through similar things are feeling. And suddenly they realize, maybe for the first time, that they're not alone, that they're not dealing with these emotions by themselves. And I listened to that, and you can imagine it's quite moving when you hear these stories. And I thought, leaders do this too. Our outside mask will say successful, confident, I'm in control and that sort of thing. Know what I'm doing, and yet on the inside of our mask, we're unsure. We're worried. We're overwhelmed. We're scared. And imagine if we as leaders could begin to share our inside masks, even with just other leaders, so we could all understand that, we're in this together, right? That this is a fundamental truth of leadership, that we don't have all the answers, that we don't know always what we're doing, even though we're trying to project this image out to others.
That's a beautiful example of showing your authenticity as a leader. And it's a very visceral example of how we do all feel. I mean, I think as much as you hear about imposter syndrome, the fact is that all of us have our insecurities. All of us have those negative thoughts that are kind of rolling in our heads, but we think that we're the only ones that feel that. But just like the example with Ellie's Place, as soon as people started trading masks, they saw that others felt the same way that we did. And so I guess that's an important theme that I wanted to touch on, because I think a lot of times when you're in a leadership position, or you're entrepreneurial and you're trying to go it at your own, and all of those doubts and insecurities start to really weigh at you, I think realizing that everybody else feels that way is a very powerful and reassuring thing, right?
Well, I think sometimes, and we might begin to believe this about ourselves, and we certainly probably believe it about others, or people believe it about us as leaders, that we're somehow different, that we're not as human as the rest of them, that we've got some magical power, yet we're the same, and a lot of times, and I think the saddest part of leadership often is one where we wear one mask at work and we wear a different mask at home. And quite frankly, I mean, in that delta between what we portray to the world and who we really are is often a lot of pain for human beings. We can't live a lie most of our waking hours and not expect it to have some kind of effect. And so we're going to try and escape that pain one way or another. I mean, it could be self-medication. It could be some, just simply disconnecting from people when we're away. And I'm guessing there are probably a few spouses somewhere out there in the world who look at their significant other and say, man, I really wish I could get the person at work here at home. Why are you bringing all this weight in at home all the time? And it's because we can't be authentic at work. And again, I don't think this is about putting the full range of emotion out every single day. I think there is an element of leadership that's fake it till you make it. That we have to go into things believing we can get through stuff. And so it's not about putting on that full range of emotions every day. But I think everyone benefits, including the leader themselves, when everybody sees him as a real or her as a real human being.
Well, and the fake it till you make it, I mean, it's not surrendering to those doubts, that having a mindset that I can overcome whatever this problem is and turning those problems into opportunities, that is a huge element and a lot of what you talk about in the book. So what do you think then are some of the biggest challenges that people face when they are trying to dig within themselves to become this joyful leader, when all of those self-doubts and all of those things that hold all of us back? How do you push through to really realize that you can be happy and joyful, and you can set an example for others as the same?
We have to all realize that you're going to go into this with the heart racing and stomach feeling uncomfortable, kind of like jumping out of an airplane for the first time when you step into leadership, and that you have to figure out for yourself, where does my courage come from? And for me, I know it was simply a belief that things could be better than customary. I had to try stuff. We get a lot of people who come and visit our company, and they love what they see. They want some piece of it for themselves. But invariably, at the end of any talk I give or tour here at Menlo that I might lead, I often hear a very similar vein of thinking, kind of like, this is so cool, Rich. I love what you've created here with your team, but we can't do it because we're too, and then fill in the blank. We're too big, we're too old, we're too this, we're too that, and so on. Or if I do encourage them to begin trying stuff or take an idea back, they run into the person who's about to, who didn't hear what they heard, who didn't hear the same talk or read the same book or went to the same conference. And they come in and they're like, hey, I got this great idea. I think we should try this. And somebody who hasn't heard what they've heard says, yeah, that won't work here. That's not us. I mean, HR wouldn't approve, or, there's some policy that will prevent that. And I arm the world with a simple phrase, and maybe I can give this one to your listeners as well. Look that person in the eye and say, yep, I get it, but let's try something. Let's not defeat it before we try it. Let's run the experiment. Let's move towards action orientation versus contemplation orientation. And I think when we start to tap into this, let's try stuff and see what happens kind of attitude, it's amazing how much energy springs forth just from that.
You've mentioned a key word in there in that phrase, and that's let's. It's a very encouraging word because it's both you and I, it's everybody together, and we're all kind of in this together to try something. And that's a very powerful thing. That's a very motivating thing. I am curious though, when you kind of first said that, when you in your own situation looked at someone and said, you know what, let's just try it. What were those circumstances, and how did you get to the point where you stopped hearing the no's and understood that maybe this is just part of the journey?
Yeah, there are so many stories I could share on that front. One of my favorites, though, is a Menlo story where one of our team members went off on maternity leave for a few months, and then she was ready to come back to work. And the daycare they planned to put little Maggie in was full, and grandparents lived too far away to help. And there was this exciting new project starting that she wanted to be a part of. She wanted to get it on the ground floor of the project. So she came to me. She says, "Rich, I'm ready to come back to work, but we have this challenge. We don't know what to do with Maggie." And in that moment, unbeknownst to Tracy, the mom, there was a screaming match in my brain that Tracy never heard. There was a dark voice on one shoulder and the bright voice on the other shoulder. And the dark voice said, "Don't you dare say what you're about to say. HR will shoot you. The lawyers will freak out. And the bright voice said, "It's your company. You can do whatever you want. You don't even have an HR department." And so I looked at Tracy. I said, "Bring her in." And she was astounded. She didn't even know what to make of what I just said. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Bring her into work." She said, "All day?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Every day?" I said, "Why not?" She looked around this big open room because we have this one of those, open office environments that you hear about. And she said, "Rich, where will I put her?" Because this was not, we're going to build a daycare. This was, baby's going to be with mom. And I said, "Tracy, she's 3 months old. She's not going anywhere. Keep her in a front pack, put her in a bassinet on the floor. Just keep her near you." And she said, "But what if she makes a fuss?" I said, "Here, it's like a noisy restaurant. You'll never hear it." And she says, "But what if she makes that big baby fuss?" She says, "You raised 3 daughters. You know what that's like." I said, "Tracy, you're the mom. I trust you. You'll do the right thing. We'll work it out together. Let's run the experiment." Well, I will tell you today in the office is little Josiah. Josiah is Menlo baby number 22 in the last 11 years. And he comes in all day, every day. I've been coming in since he was about 3 months old, and he'll probably be here till he's about 6 months old. And Menlo baby number 23 has already been announced on the way, arriving early in the spring next year. So this has been a wonderful experiment for us. And a lot of people love the baby story because it's just so kind of heartwarming and compelling and that sort of thing. But I warn them, don't focus on the baby. Focus on the experiment part. It may not be appropriate for people to bring children into where they work. If you work at a pharmaceutical company with chemicals everywhere, you can bring babies to work, okay? That's all right. There's nothing wrong with your organization. If they say it just couldn't work, that's okay. It works for us. But the broader concept of let's run the experiment energizes people. And I learned something in that interaction about me, is that when I looked at Tracy and I said, "You're the mom, I trust you." Because I knew, from raising our own kids, that my wife would always be more concerned than anyone if we were in a restaurant and the baby was making noise and oh my gosh, everybody's going to be looking at me. I knew that Tracy would do the right thing, and I didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if it would work. I mean, that's the most important thing, because we had a small nonprofit come in here not too long ago, and they were thinking of their own baby experiment. And they came in, they visited with us, met with a few parents, a few non-parents, just to see what it's like. And right at the end of the meeting, one of their leaders said, "Okay, great, thanks for the information, Rich and team." Then he looked at the rest of his small nonprofit team, which is about 8 people, and he said, "So let's form a committee and write a policy." And my heart sank at that point, and I looked at him. I said, "If you do that as your next step, this idea will die. Go run the experiment. Try it." And this is where I think we get caught up in human organizations a lot, is we start doing the analysis paralysis, getting all caught up in our deepest, darkest fears about what could go wrong. And quite frankly, most of the time, it doesn't happen that way. And it hasn't happened for us with 22 babies. I mean, it's just been incredible how this has worked for us.
You've mentioned a key word in there in that phrase, and that's let's. It's a very encouraging word because it's both you and I, it's everybody together, and we're all kind of in this together to try something. And that's a very powerful thing. That's a very motivating thing. I am curious though, when you kind of first said that, when you in your own situation looked at someone and said, "You know what, let's just try it." What were those circumstances, and how did you get to the point where you stopped hearing the no's and understood that maybe this is just part of the journey?
Yeah, I have been an engineer most of my life, writing code in the earliest part of my career, then leading teams of coders in the later part of my career. And I think I've come to describe my leadership life with a metaphor of an airplane. Right. I also have a pilot's license, and there's four fundamental forces at work on an aircraft. There's the force of lift that pulls the plane off the ground. There's the force of weight that countermands the lift, but weight has actually utility. You can't. There's no reason to fly if you don't have passengers and luggage and fuel and all that sort of thing. So those two forces work against each other. Then there's the force of thrust that pulls the airplane forward, given by the engines. But then there's the force of drag that works in the other direction because the plane has width and things sticking out in the air that are going to slow it down. And I think for an early part of my career, while I wanted to achieve, the joy of flight and the human teams that I was a part of, whether I was a member of the team or eventually leading them, it just felt like the plane was too heavy. There was too much drag. We would never get off the ground. We could only taxi around on the runway. And that's just no fun. I mean, there's no energy in that. So I kept probably like those dreams most of us have about personally flying without aircraft or anything, where we're like running down the street flapping our arms and we never seem to get off the ground, or we never seem to get high enough to get over the trees, and we just get frustrated with that kind of feeling. I think that's what a lot of people feel like at work, because they're like, well, I got to go get permission. I got to, we got to get this into the next management team meeting to see it. And the trouble is, if you do that, if you develop that kind of spirit and attitude, you start to realize that, well, that's just too much work. So I'll just accept the status quo. And at one point, I mean, what happened for me, the tipping point for me was by my mid 30s, I didn't even want to be in my profession anymore. I had lost so much heart for what I was doing for a living that I was seriously thinking about starting a canoe camp in the Boundary Waters of Minnesota. It was an escape plan. It was escapist for sure. But in that moment, I decided, you know what? In this trough of disillusionment, in this room filled with manure that I fought with every day, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. There's got to be an answer. And so that actually, it was almost like the disillusionment fueled me, because I thought, if I can get through this, there's probably some amazing thing waiting on the other side. So I just started reading. I think that's a fundamental element, is to become a reader, reach outside yourself, get ideas from others, get inspired by others who've maybe done some work ahead of you that can blaze a trail. And a lot of the books I read were not books on technology, because quite frankly, that's easy compared to how to build human organizations. It was about, how do we organize teams? How do we think in a systems fashion? How do we manage things in a way that isn't so bureaucratic that it just weighs our organizational aircraft down so far it'll just never get off the ground.
Absolutely, because it not getting stuck in your head and not getting stuck in, I guess, the policy, whether that policy is literally a policy or it's the process of thinking, okay, well, this has to be done and this has to be done, and well, I can't do this until this. I think that's something that a lot of entrepreneurs face, where they think, well, I'm not successful until I'm doing that. Tell me about your own experience with that thinking and how you've broken out of it.
I am really taken over the last couple of years with the books that come out of Arbinger Institute and Vital Smarts. Those two companies have created some amazing books on human relationships, because I think at the end of the day, the teams we lead are working on complicated things, and we got to bind people together in human teams. There's no longer the ability for individual heroes to actually accomplish anything. We need to form big teams of people to work on big problems. And Arbinger, with their books Leadership and Self-Deception and The Anatomy of Peace and The Outward Mindset, and Vital Smarts with their books Crucial Conversations and Influencer, have really formed my thinking as well as the thinking of people on our team.
Playing off one of the titles that you just mentioned, what's an outward mindset?
Yeah, so this is so critical to how we think about our purpose here at Menlo, and quite frankly, how we think about joy here at Menlo, that it all sort of, when I read this book, it just made sense to me in such a dramatic way. Because a lot of people come here and are like, you talk about joy at Menlo, which is a weird word in business for
Yeah.
sure. We usually look for joy outside of work, and yet we're finding it inside of work. And I tell them, I said, oh, understand, our joy is externally focused. It's an outward mindset. It's the idea that we can crisply, cleanly, and powerfully answer two questions about why Menlo exists as a company. And I think every organization should contemplate seriously the answers to what seemingly are two simple questions. But I will warn your listeners that you really need to give this some thought. Who do you serve? And what would delight look like for them?
Hmm.
And as soon as you ask those two questions, you have taken yourself from thinking inwardly to thinking outwardly, not only as individuals on a team, but as an entire organization. Because when I talk about who we serve, and I'm going to offer a warning, because the easiest answer is, well, we serve our employees, our investors, and our customers, some fashion of that. And I'm like, yep, I get that. Those are three important stakeholder groups, and you should take good care of all three of them. However, I'm going to encourage your listeners to think beyond those three obvious stakeholder groups and think about the people whose lives are impacted by the work you do inside of your organization, who may never meet you, may never know who you are, but somehow the work of your heart, your hands, and your minds affected them. Now, for us, we focus on the end users of the software. We're a custom software design and development firm. People come to us with projects and we sign contracts with them, and they're our customers, and they pay us to build great software and design great user experiences. But every day, who we're thinking about are the people who one day use the work that happens in this room. People we will never meet. People don't pay us for what we do, but ultimately their lives will be touched every single day when they sit down at a computer, grab a mouse, start clicking on buttons and screens and printing reports. And most software, I mean, this is the sad truth of my industry, most software tortures people. And we didn't want to torture people. We wanted them to say, I love this software. And in order to do that, you have to recraft the entire organization around that fundamental principle. And every company has these kind of opportunities. For example, think of a life insurance company, right? You could say, oh, we serve our policyholders. Yeah, that's true. Yes, you should. But I believe the people you actually serve are the beneficiaries of the policy, the people you will never meet, the people who won't even know who you are as a life insurance company until they are in probably one of the hardest moments of their lives, when they lost someone so dear to them that that person had the heart and the mindset to say, you know what, when I'm gone, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. So I've bought this policy for you. And imagine the difference between a phone call that comes into a life insurance company where the claims department has been, say, outsourced to the cheapest provider whose instructions were to make sure you prevent fraud at every possible turn, versus a company when the claims department picks up the phone and understands with empathy and compassion that you're probably in one of the hardest moments of your life, and they're going to step in and take good care of you and make sure that uh, while there's maybe some legal things that have to be taken care of, that they realize first what place you are in your life while you're going through all of that, and that you could actually make this as positive an experience as possible, even though they're dealing with grief.
One thing you mentioned in the book that I was curious about, you said joy is different than happiness. Will you explain that?
Yeah, I remember in the first book, Joy Inc., where the subtitle is How We Built a Workplace People Love. My editor said, hey, Rich, we've got an idea for a subtitle. Take a peek inside the world's happiest workplace. And I said, oh, no, no, no.
Mm-hmm.
Happy and joy are two very different things. And she said, what do you mean? I said, oh, happiness is momentary. Are we happier? Sure. I mean, we get dogs and babies and laughter and all that sort of thing. There's certainly happy moments here at Menlo, probably every single day. But to accomplish great work requires a long arc of hard work, sometimes frustrating work. Sometimes we could get angry at times if we're being prevented from doing the work we really think could change the world. And that fuels our spirit. This long arc of joy, where when finally the hard work of life is done, and you deliver something to the world, and the world starts coming back and saying, "I love this thing you've created," and then suddenly all the hard work that went into it, all the effort, all of the teamwork, all of the arguments you had to make sure you were producing the best possible thing you could, all become worthwhile. And for us, here, that's joy.
Hmm.
And I think we get that in so many different parts of our lives. If we take that spirit and energy, is like, what's the long-term goal? And again, back to that purpose-driven questions: who do we serve, and what would delight look like for them? uh, when we start to see that delight come back, when we start to get the reports from the people we serve who say, "I love this thing you've created, you make my life better because of it," that's where our joy comes from.
And I think a lot of people could say the same thing about any big project in their life, that the blood, the sweat, and the tears, all of the difficult times that you go through in order to launch something, or to, whether it's a book, it's a website, it's a product, it's any type of personal venture that feels not like just a widget, but it's a labor of love. When you hear people say that it's made a difference in their lives, that makes it all worthwhile.
You bet. And think of that classic story, and I think this is a classic leadership story, actually, and I will dare say a classic joyful leadership story of the Three Bricklayers, right? And probably most of us have heard this story where somebody walks up, sees three bricklayers doing exactly the same task. Asks the first one, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm laying bricks." Second one says, "I'm building a wall." A little bit bigger picture. Go to the third one, and he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm building a cathedral."
Hmm.
Right? And I think as leaders, we need to put that "we're building a cathedral" picture in front of our teams regularly, because hey, laying bricks is probably boring work. You slabbing mortar and laying a brick, picking up another one. Your back probably hurts at the end of the day. Your knees are probably shaking, and you may be even a little endangered if you're working on bricks on a high wall or something like that. But this third bricklayer has this idea that he's building a cathedral. Now I want to take it a step further than that. That bricklayer in the old days would probably never in his lifetime see the cathedral completed. He would never worship there, never bring his family there, have his children baptized there, or anything like that. He's doing this for future generations.
Right.
So I think those are the kind of things as leaders we need to inspire in our teams, is that, again, the work of our hearts, our hands, and our minds is for such a worthy purpose. It might be okay if you never personally see its results, but you had that chance to work with pride and believe you were making a difference in the world, even if you'd never see the end result.
Right. Well, as we start to wrap up, I've got just a couple of quick hit questions for you. So you ready?
Yes.
What's the very best piece of advice that you've ever gotten?
Oh, goodness. Volunteer.
Hmm.
This idea that, if somebody, especially if you're young in your career and you're trying to figure out things, and you're in a particular role, step outside your role. If somebody comes in the room and says, "Hey, we need some help at a trade show," and you just raise your hand and say, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I could help with that." Just the idea that, get outside yourself, get outside your role, get outside your education, and start adding to your experience.
What's the worst piece of advice that you've ever gotten?
It actually happened in eighth grade. A teacher asked me, says, "Rich, what do you want to be when you grow up?" It seemed like a good question for an eighth grader. And I said, "I'm thinking about airline pilot."
Mm-hmm.
And she looked at me, and you think of all the responses a teacher could give a young person, right? And she says to me, she says, "Yeah, we seldom get to ever be what we think we're going to be at your age." And I'm thinking, I look back at it now, and I'm happy with the way my life turned out. And
Right.
I'm a
Right.
pilot anyways as a hobby. So, but I think I would have been a pretty darn good pilot, and I would have been really happy doing it. But I think, when we're in that moment, and somebody's counting on us to give them a good answer, encourage them.
What movie can you quote by heart?
Oh, goodness. The Matrix.
Really? Why is that?
For me, especially the original. I mean, the other ones were fun, but the original just was so powerful. But the quote that I keep is when Morpheus and Neo are together, and he shows him the red pill and the blue pill, and he says, take the blue pill, Morpheus or Neo, and you'll forget you were ever here. And he says, but take the red pill, and it won't change anything. It will simply reveal the truth.
Right.
And the truth, of course, was a very ugly world. And then eventually, when they got to a certain point, Morpheus's mentor says, I can only show you the door, Neo. You have to walk through it. And I think there's so many moments in life where, if you are counting on mentors to guide you to a certain place, there is that moment where you finally have to walk through the door yourself and see what's on the other side. Your mentor isn't going to be with you at that point. It's
Yeah.
your life. Walk through the door. There's probably a whole bunch of other quotes that could come to mind if I really conjured it up, but that movie I just thought was great metaphor for a lot of things that we face in our leadership lives.
Absolutely. And then finally, based on the conversation we've had today and the reflection that you've had over a successful lifetime, and the legacy that you have been able to lead, what would you say is your secret to success?
Get a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
I tried the other route for a while, and that didn't work well. Take care of yourself, physically, mentally. Don't wallow around in the swamp. There's so many places we humans these days, in particular, can just wallow around in and stay in that negative place, and get into an echo chamber that convinces us that everything is going badly. So look at the wonder of the world. Look at the things that are going on around you. So I travel a lot. I spend a lot of time on airplanes, and somebody said, do you ever get worried about what could go wrong? And I pulled out the map, all those maps they have in the back of airplane magazines with all the red lines on them, where all the flights go. And I said, you realize how many times a day, just for this airline, these lines go up and they go down? No issue at all. I said, you realize when there isn't an event, it's because it's so rare that it's news. It's newsworthy. And so I think carrying an optimistic attitude, not, still reality based, it can't be all rainbows and unicorns, but just protect that flame inside of you, that flame that when it goes out, it can't be relit. And there's nobody else who can protect that flame that burns inside your heart than you. And part of that is stay out of the negative spaces as much as possible.